Boomer, Zoomer, Millennial. How important do you think these labels are? Because in my humble opinion, I think that they are extremely important. For those living in some major cosmopolitan city or suburb in America, or some other Americanized part of the world, don't act like you don't know what I mean. If you are not some passionate minority or one of the few remaining highly religious people in your society, then you likely do not identify that much with any particular cultural background. What you likely identify yourself with is honestly something more vain, like your favorite football team, your preferred type of sexual partner, your distinguishing brand of real or imagined neurodivergence, and or your favorite polarizing political ideology. These are just a few examples. These characteristics that more and more of us are using to individuate ourselves are mostly based on personal taste rather than some immutable factor that has been integral to our identities and the communities that surround us, their identities, throughout our entire lives and their entire lives. However, there is one major demographic distinction which has actually gained in relevance over our lives, and that is our age group. In our rapidly technologically advancing, globalized world, our interdependence on the exports of any foreign nation, outside of North Korea of course, and a few other examples, has limited the role of once preeminent cultural institutions in more modernized nations, as, especially in the West, we have become more reliant on waves of migration from societies with very different customs, values, and temperaments to keep our economies running. The exponential increases in our standards of living has not only enabled the common person to live independently from one's local community, but migrants can now assimilate into the dominant culture of our societies within a generation or two, as the legal and informal requirements to become an American or Brit or Argentinian, whatever, have been reduced to a single rule, which is just don't break the law. So, in our multicultural societies where anyone of the same economic class is functionally doing the same kind of work, living the same kind of lifestyles, more of us are questioning whether there are really any differences between us outside of maybe a few differences in physical features and personality traits. Like, be honest, as an Asian, as a woman, as a Catholic, as whatever you are, what is it that you do on a daily basis that makes you any different from a, good old white Protestant man? I'd reckon that the younger you are, the more difficult it will be to answer these questions. So, nowadays, given the pace of technological progress, the only important difference between people has really just become the differences in our abilities to use whatever newest, smartest technology or related application and all the new forms of media that are coming out.
Your mambo days are over. You want to wiggle over to the stove and get my stuff.
Getting used to that, which becomes important because the vast majority of us have white-collar jobs and friends and family that we cannot schedule time to hang out with in person during most weekdays and two-day weekends, which means that the divide between older people and younger people has never been more drastic than it is today. If you've been listening to what I've been saying, then you must understand that generational thinking is not some recent fad that abruptly entered the popular lexicon because some kids started laughing about the okay boomer meme. Generational thinking might be a recent phenomenon, only dating back to about a century ago, but it has become an important field of sociological analysis since the march of progress towards greater technological advancement is continuing to divide our societies more disparately along generational lines, while at the same time leveling every other kind of demographic category to being pretty much just one mass. Therefore, the youngest generations are the closest to being just one unified monoculture, with most differences between younger people being based on personal beliefs rather than one's daily practices, while the oldest generations are the furthest away from being culturally homogenous, with our grandparents still retaining their accents and subtle prejudices against those people that look a little weird maybe, and occasionally might sound a little funny too, stuff like that. Talking about funny people, one of the most important distinctions between each of the four generations getting talked about today is the differences in their humor. This might sound irrelevant, but it's not. Understanding this aspect does not only provide an example of some surface level differences between generations, these differences help us understand the distinct psychological types of each generation, especially regarding the cultural elites that represent each respective zeitgeist. Okay, yeah, Let me quickly define some of those terms that I just kind of spewed out. Firstly, what I mean by psychological type, this is a grouping of people categorized by their predispositions towards certain patterns of thinking and doing, primarily to cope with their own psycho-spiritual problems. And secondly, when I talk about so-called cultural leaders, I'm talking about the public figures, most commonly the celebrities, that help define a generation. To start off with, we can boil down the primary generational differences in humor to baby boomers and their preceding generations being more sincere, and Generation Xers and their succeeding generations being not only more ironic, but more ironic than likely any generation preceding them in all of human history. So in this video, we will learn why our current cultural landscape has become dominated by irony and how this shift relates to the decline of traditional cultural institutions, which began with the baby boomers. The spirit of our current age, or the Zoomergeist. I don't care if you think that is a stupid term. Just keep listening. The Zoomergeist is one that emerged from the shifting of our society's ideological superstructure, which can be best represented by the media and academia, towards a consensus that is decidedly postmodern, which might be a loaded term, but you'll get what I'm saying when I'm getting later into the video. In this cultural milieu, any grand narratives that once grounded our societies, may be the beliefs of the Christian faith or the beliefs of secular yet still universalist and objectivist systems of thought like liberalism, have been stripped of their influence over the minds of people. Initially, this process began with the baby boomers, who began the revolt against the perceived naive realism of the silent generation and their forebears by attacking their Puritan-descended WASP worldview that fetishized work for work's sake and demonized sexuality outside of procreation by becoming hippies that smoked pot, popped Plan B pills, and produced obscene and abstract art that stood in opposition to the storytelling, instrument playing, and other artistic conventions of the earlier generations. In their attempts to bring about a new era of liberty and a more equitably distributed kind of prosperity to get expanded across the modern West, this generation might have attacked the sacred cows of their ancestors, but despite dissent from some more nihilistic Frenchies in academia, these boomers still had some sacred cows of their own that they wanted to protect. The vocal minority of this generation, whom were the people that were behind the counterculture movement of the 60s, were all highly idealistic and were highly motivated by their seemingly enlightened values, which came from a genuine place of contempt for the ongoing mistreatment of women and unjust antagonism against minorities that continued into the mid-20th century. Yet, sincere optimism, as they were anticipating the culmination of a flourishing society where peaceful coexistence with other cultures would be possible. These people knew that they needed to rebel in some way against their ruling power structures. However, the movement was mostly disorganized, with dissidents ranging from flower power, tree-hugging hippies that just wanted peace and love and psychotropic substances legalized for everyone,
If a lot of people smoke some weed, the world would be a better place to live.
to revolutionary militants that wanted to destroy any societal institution that they perceived as being too bourgeois, too bougie.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this forward-looking revolutionary fervor would eventually sputter out as, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and a string of, I will just say, suspicious, to say the least, suspicious assassinations of notable counterculture leaders. This anomalously massive generation inherited a period of unprecedented material prosperity that was at least anticipated to finally get expanded across every poor and suffering group of society, as it seemed that their generation's egalitarian revolution would succeed in racially and sexually integrating society. But such was not the case. Upon entering our society's most elite institutions, most baby boomers became quite complacent, which would become a huge problem as the radical shifts in our society that these same people had just sparked in the late 1960s were not being effectively regulated with any viable replacements to the sacred cows that were then defaced, primarily as it came to the nuclear family and racial segregation. So this generation was not prepared for their latchkey offspring. I have not discussed much about irony or sincerity for this generation yet, but only because this dichotomy does not really relate to baby boomers, because everyone at this point was primarily very sincere and they were vitalized by genuine hopes and dreams that they wanted to actualize in the real world and could reasonably do so. I mean, they are the children of the greatest generation. There are so many major world historic people that came before them that fundamentally changed their society, often for the better, though in most of the 20th century it was a lot of crap. But they could reasonably do so. Therefore, baby boomers will be used as a baseline for a healthy generation, as they felt actively attracted to the society that they lived in and felt in control of the path that it was going down. Unfortunately, this could not be said for the next 3 generations, which have become progressively more alienated from society and therefore have become more prone to ironic detachment. Eventually, the new cultural regime that began with the boomers would seemingly become subverted once Generation X began to overwhelm the media apparatuses with alt-rock, hip-hop, and subversive movies and shows, primarily sitcoms, that deconstructed societal institutions such as the nuclear family, American suburbia, white-collar office jobs, and the police state, which, despite the major progress made to eliminate the first institution, the latter 3 that have been similarly heavily criticized since the 60s counterculture had actually become more prevalent and remained virtually unreformed outside of more people getting allowed into these neighborhoods and into these careers. So, given the self-evident incongruence between the initial promises of the boomers and the conditions that they actually created, there was one major qualitative difference that developed among Gen Xers that distinguished them from their boomer parents and, I guess, uncles and aunts and whatnot. They're slightly older, I guess, older cousins, whatever. And that was Gen X's deviation away from sincerity and into irony, as this is the generation that fully realized the so-called age of irony that we still live in today. The ideological superstructure might have massively shifted in response to the 1960s countercultural movement, but the economic base of society remained more rigidly hierarchical than ever. So despite the overwhelming optimism of the 1980s popular culture with its champagne wishes and caviar dreams, the people that were then coming to age caught this fake positivity and hijacked the common lines of the popular media depictions of a more utopian reality to retrofit them in a manner that satirized the absurdity of their unrealistic narratives as a means to better adjust the messaging to fit the very different settings that the average Gen Xer actually lived in, even if this satirization was often done in bad taste. This impulsive response to alienation reflects Gen X's cynicism towards the hypocritical elites that preach revolution but practice conformity, as not only was Gen X a generation that began the great resignation from traditional community institutions, but this generation, who are the parents of Gen Z, chose to pursue more personalized forms of non-professional activities instead. So while Gen Z is the generation of YouTube and social media and other consumer content on the internet, Gen X was defined as being the generation with the latchkey and the television, and often the television set was in their room. So 2 generations defined by being consumers in that way. Given this generation's idiosyncratic independence from family and community due to their parents often not giving them proper attention, the high volumes of wealth at their disposal, and a lurid distrust of once preeminent institutions as taught by the prominent cultural elites of their adolescence, this generation would begin to pursue more antisocial pastimes as television watching, drug consumption, and promiscuous sex became more commonplace. The media reflected this shift in outlook as iconic characters in media became more morally gray, popular genres became more abrasive, and the common messaging became more misanthropic.
I hope I cut myself shaving tomorrow. I hope it bleeds all day long.
However, while the first Grand Theft Auto game and edgy rock and rollers like Marilyn Manson and Kurt Cobain, they might have offended the prevailing yuppie sensibilities of the now matured boomer generation, the nihilism and skepticism of Gen X were merely the natural continuation of the goals of boomers to eviscerate any traces of absolutism from Western culture, which were best exemplified by such cultural movements as punk rock and new American cinema. The latter movement having begun as a result of the repeal of the Hays Code, which, to summarize, allowed filmmakers to uncensor realistic displays of sex and violence. Overall, while we are still predominantly ruled under boomers to this day, our government practically being a gerontocracy and all the major corporations similarly being led by such people. The cultural elites of Gen X have had an indelible impact on the media, as the popular genres and character archetypes have not really diverged much from those depicted in popular artistic works released around the turn of the millennium.
Where did they find these goons they elected to? Oh, comedy. Oh, it's like something that a madman would conceive.
Given that any movement that leans towards misanthropy and defeatism can only last a very short period, the final generation that precedes Gen Z, the Millennials, will return back to the more optimistic idealism of the boomers. Gen Y would continue to pursue a more egalitarian society in a purely negativistic manner by assaulting the formerly preeminent traditional cultural institutions like the church and the nuclear family. Despite these institutions having already lost most of their power over our daily lives, directly due to boomers having seized governmental and corporate power from the last remaining people that upheld the values of these foundational institutions. However, the agenda that is currently getting arbitrated by the cultural elites of Gen Y has nearly reversed the democratic and libertarian ideals of the boomers, as en masse, this generation has opted to commit slander against and even physically assault anyone upholding any kind of more bigoted worldview than their own to ensure that their radical egalitarian utopia is materialized. This anomalous turn towards authoritarianism might come as a surprise to those, with more conventional, classical, liberal values from, at least in the American context. But while the previous two generations were motivated by their hedonistic desires, which had been forcefully repressed by older generations, firstly in reaction to puritanical thinking, and then secondly in reaction to the vain consumerism of the yuppies, which only promoted certain vices as a marketing ploy, Gen Y comes from a much more ascetic perspective. At the start of the new millennium, as this group was coming into being, the economic base of the global north was beginning to decline, and the gap in outcomes between socioeconomic classes were further widening. So it became obvious that the egalitarian goals of the boomers had not been realized, which is a failure that the millennials would attribute to the unwillingness of boomers to utilize their positions of institutional power to enforce any of their agenda. Understanding that a focus on individual liberation through wealth accumulation is a dead end that only leads to former conformity to the whims of late-stage capitalist corporatism, which is a trap that Gen X fell into upon resigning from community life in favor of watching television and smoking crack. This generation's role models greatly diverged in their inclinations by going into HR departments and departments related to sustainability, equity, whatever, rather than psychedelic music festivals and gay bars. Given this intention to break away from consumeristic impulses and an individualistic worldview, the cultural elites of Gen Y and their toadies would initiate a totalizing political movement that goes against the will of the people, which attempts to forcibly convert people to their civic religion through victimizing even their fellow Kendrick Lamar listening, Euphoria watching, Palestinian flag waving, xenogender pronoun using libcoms that happen to have a slightly less educated, in quotations, opinion on some seemingly random topic that does not even indirectly relate to anything suggestive of one's personal beliefs, such as one's opinions about excessive soy consumption being potentially hazardous for testosterone production, and one's assumption that cryptocurrency could become a good alternative to physical currencies at some point in the future. Like, no way, fuck you, fuck you reactionary pig, watch it Bomber Guy, watch Voting Ideas, goon to sissy hypno, you alt-right fucker.
Everybody just yells and screams.
The warnings that Alan Bloom gave concerning Gen X in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, have been fully realized in Gen Y. The transformation of our society's reigning hegemonic ideology from the openness of the boomers' relativism into the closeness of Gen Y's dogmatic hyper-intersectionality has been completed. In the 21st century, not only have fields of study devoted to the further understanding of non-straight, non-white, and non-male groups become standardized across educational institutions, but Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Mozart, and other key figures from the Western canon of arts, sciences, and philosophy have become excluded from school curriculums. Which I would defend the first point, and I guess you could make an argument in favor of the second point, but these great men of history, so-called, if you want to say so-called, whatever, yes, they're being excluded, but they're not getting replaced by any important figures from non-Western canons, may they be African, Islamic, Darbic, Taoic, something else. What is actually replacing the Western canon is just some vague anti-Western non-canon that's also created by Western people themselves that only promotes neoliberal assimilationism disguised as ethno-relativism. Across the humanities, the social sciences, and even in departments related to more applied sciences, like this is even invading STEM, the curriculums of these schools would rather endlessly deconstruct Western civilization, its institutions, and its history than push forward anything positive and inspirational about other cultures, unless it is prefaced with how important it is to avoid cultural appropriation.
How's your life been since we last saw you?
It's pretty good.
Which means that, unless we can fit ourselves into the most extremely rare and disabled combination of protected demographic categories, then we're just fucked. That's it.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over. What the fuck are we gonna do now?
This civic religion, wokeism, yeah, let's call it that. I don't care about how Fox News and the Daily Wire and your strange dad overuse the term. This wokeism...
Oh, I'm saying. Animal?
Getting promoted by Gen Y might be extremely different from the reformed liberalism of the boomers, but Gen Y represents a slight return to sincerity. Let me emphasize my use of the adjective slight. Most people that might feign sincerity are actively shielding their personal beliefs from the public sphere by LARPing as fellow Gen Y brand neoliberals to get ahead in their respective industries, which leads me to the most important aspect about this generation. The wokeism that has come to define the millennial geist, which is getting spearheaded by a vocal minority of young white liberals, many of whom being the nepo babies of the same boomer yuppies that create our current material conditions. This movement has proven itself to be a living example of how egalitarianism and democratic values can become devastatingly anti-populistic and surprisingly elitist, with this movement no longer even trying to represent the ideals of the working majority or even the lowest quintile or decile of our societies, but some abstract, most disadvantaged group, which necessitates every more able person to radically change all their beliefs, all their practices, to ensure that these idols are protected from the evil one, which is systematic bigotry, white supremacy, whatever. The explicit fault of this uniquely millennial ideology, even from the surface, reveals to us that, as with every other generation, it is not some rational current of thought producing any unifying ideology among a generation. Rather, a generation is defined by their psychological type, and Gen Y can be defined by their inferiority complexes and over-socialization. Of course, I am overgeneralizing. Of course, I am making very definitive claims. But when you look at the elites and when you look at what kind of things are being pushed by the media and academia and other parts of our cultural apparatus, you cannot say otherwise that there is any significant contingent of this generation that is actively going against it. It seems to be that this group has taken the reins of representing this generation, no matter how diverse the beliefs and practices of the people that are in this generation in America and more other Americanized places are. This is what is going on. And honestly, there doesn't seem to be anything that would get me thinking otherwise. The people crying crocodile tears for every country that has not legalized gay marriage, and every state that has not enforced gender-neutral bathroom laws, and every other place where progress towards a hyper-intersectional end of history has not been made, these people are almost always the products of social environments that excessively inhibited their abilities to express their instinctual dispositions towards certain passions and interests in favor of fulfilling some impossible guidelines for becoming a model citizen that no authority figure teaching this bullhonky actually follow, such as calling out people for using slur-adjacent words or spreading rumors about some SA sexual assault allegation to fight against the hashtag rape culture, or by attending some protests in the real world, but most likely on social media, after some novel political spectacle occurs. Due to the abuse of emotionally manipulative role models, these people never got to develop their unique senses of identity and were only able to identify themselves relationally to other people that they do not even honestly care all that much about, despite desiring constant affirmation from them, likely due to an insatiable thirst for attention and affection that might be lacking from one's parents that might be distant in a lot of ways. All that these compulsive people pleasers want is to be good little school guys and gals and non-binary pals that make their teachers and pupils proud, as they know that they can't do the same for anyone else. The eventual outcome of this is a pathology classified by low self-esteem, weak friends, and an identity built off of the negations of one's actual identity as a insert race, insert gender, insert religion, insert meaningful occupation and or hobby person. You guys might say that I over-exaggerated the more authoritarian tendencies of this generation, but either way, our society has become exponentially more anxiety-stricken over time as people have become far more distrustful of others and their motives, especially regarding the colossal sum of people that have become genuinely worried about misspeaking on a serious subject or joking about something off-color to the wrong crowd of people, which, worst case scenario, could result in someone getting offended on behalf of someone else that they'd have never met, enough to dial the PC police and get them publicly castrated. It is important for me to explain that this trend back toward sincerity is based on self-preservation in ever more stress-inducing social settings and is purely inauthentic. So the sincerity of Gen Y is far more corrosive than the irony of Gen X, as it is, in internet terms, fake and gay. So given the seismic shifts in our society's ideological superstructures, yet the stagnation and slight decline in its economic basis, well honestly at this point more than a slight decline, it might not be coming back, there continues to remain a strong degree of incongruence between the world as depicted by the media and the world as it actually exists. This disconnect is best substantiated by the existence of Generation Z, a generation that acts as a living contradiction to the heavily propagated notion that the regressive ideals of the post-World War II American dream are still prevalent and heavily influencing the minds of our youth, despite the fact that most Gen Zers are not financially capable enough to start a family with 2.5 kids, a housewife, and a dog in a 4-bedroom house with a white picket fence and a 5 to 6 figure salary office job to pay off their mortgage, which is reality that even progressive Gen Zers would prefer over our most attainable future, renting a studio apartment and living alone for however long until we get a half-decent job. Soon enough, we will no longer have to keep hearing the same old tired, sardonic criticisms of various pre-boomer sentimental notions, such as those surrounding the American dream, as outside of the office job, everything else about the classic image of the American dream, the house,
This is not my beautiful house.
the family,
This is not my beautiful wife.
that has all changed. And these prospective facets of our adult lives are no longer promoted by parents, teachers, or any other person preparing us for adulthood. At this point, few of us aspire to ascend up into the heavens to join God and our angels, and even fewer of us want to lay down our lives for our nations, which are at best nothing more than arbitrary lines on a map, and at worst a socially constructed identity tied to a place, which only exists as a reminder of the atrocious crimes against humanity that were required for its founding. Additionally, most of us grew up without both parents, or at least two guardians, living under the same roof as during our childhoods outside of our dysfunctional family homes. The only other place kids spend time is at school, which means that outside of those present at bi-monthly family gatherings, school is the only place where kids can make any lasting, meaningful relationships with other people outside of their immediate family. Given this fact, it becomes very distressing to anyone that values interpersonal bonds that few people in this generation were ever given the opportunity to become a part of any cliques at school or wherever else adolescent friend groups could be made. Church? Well, not anymore. An undeniable catalyst for this ongoing friendship recession, which is peculiarly highlighted in the youngest generations, is that the new structure of most school student bodies has begun to resemble a flat, large crowd of kids with only the exclusion of a few social outcast on the fringes, rather than vivid hierarchical environments comprised of a diversity of genuinely distinct peer groups ranging from jocks to stoners to geeks to band kids to theater kids to goths and emos and to so on. The latter image of what school life is like might seem cartoonish to us, but during the late 20th century, this was somewhat of an accurate depiction of what school life was like. And given that most people working in the media industry come from these now alternative realities, this view of school life, among other aspects of everyday life, which includes an unrelatable view of family life, is what continues to get depicted in the media, and seemingly everywhere else that depicts reality rather than is actually reality. To put it simply, my people are not getting the representation that we deserve. I am honestly pretty irritated by how the media is continuing to represent our generation. Like, obviously, not all art needs to be realistic to be good. That's a really stupid take. Idiot. But realism does matter when the settings, characters, and plots of these pieces of media are supposed to be taken as being relatable to us, when they aren't. Like, most of the popular coming-of-age movies and shows that were supposed to provide a sense of catharsis for me and my fellow kids growing up in the 2010s, these programs had such a loose grasp of our reality that it was kind of disappointing to be constantly reminded what was missing in my reality from the media depictions of school and extracurricular stuff. Kids are as much delusional as they are imaginative. So an integral part of growing up in this modern age has become learning to acquiesce with the fact that we're not the main character or anime protagonist of this video game that we call real life.
We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't.
Before we can legally enter the labor force and before our parents are no longer legally obligated to keep us in their houses, all that we are is our school report cards, and I wish I could say something else, but nothing else really at that point in our lives. Unless you play JV varsity sports ball or, yeah, again, that's really, there's nothing else of value of one of these kids.
Fuck them kids. Fuck the kids? Yeah.
Millennial writers are simply not keeping up with the times. Everything in our society is changing so fast. I mean, come on, you guys need to start writing about more important stuff, more relatable stuff about high school kids. Like how they're popping Xanny bars, zenning, watching
Kai Sin Nat.
Getting BJs in cafeteria restrooms, on film, slamming other kids' heads into brick walls, of course, on film, being hot Cheeto girls, that's a few of them, reading at a preschool level, and falling victim to sexual misconduct committed by teachers. If you don't write this shit into your media, you're going to make the universal teen angst experience of feeling that nobody understands you far worse. Generation Z is still coming into being. It is likely that we will fragment into different factions based upon either our continued opposition to the naive realism of the silent generation, their forebears, or our desire to break away from the neoliberal project of the past three generations. For those against tradition, they will either become more nihilistic than Gen X or more idealistic than Gen Y. With the nihilistic Gen Zers going further to deny any non-material spiritual reality, may that be God or any higher power looking over us, and no longer being inhibited by the intellectual and sentimental restrictions of yesteryear by accepting more hyper-rationally bigoted viewpoints and offending any common courtesy that previously existed in our once civilized society by resorting to edgy humor, retaining their ironic dispositions, and further resigning from civil society by continuing to ridicule whatever the newest products of hyper-reality are getting pumped out by our media and academic apparatuses, without much else planned for their course of action. And the other faction against tradition, the idealistic Gen Zers, joining Gen Y in perpetuating the narratives of our reigning hegemonic ideology by supporting whatever newest canonized ideals of our elite institutions, without much genuine self-reflection on why they are going with the flow when the flow is ever accelerating without their consent. They will go further on to aggressively lobby, protest, and riot for the acceptance of more personal taste-based groups, from otherkin to xenogendered persons, firstly by elite institutions, and then secondly by the masses, beginning with the most banal commoners and never ending until the last remaining few threatened with firing or expulsion from their respective institutions either exit civilized society or repress their true beliefs and passions until they probably blow a casket and
Fun post.
their workplace or school. On the other hand, the Gen Zers for tradition, may that be the same tradition as the silent generation or something else, will become virulently anti-postmodern and most importantly, unequivocally sincere. Our generation has never needed to fight any conflict against some absolutist institutions like the church or state. If anything, it is not that we have been abused by any of our society's elitist institutions. It is that we have been neglected by them. We have been taught to be open to new ideas and perspectives without ever being given any new ideas or perspectives of any value. No longer are we taught the old ideas and perspectives that people used to hold. I mean, I guess that is all we're being taught, but only in the context of them being critiqued by sardonic comedians and other contemptible figures. I'm not denying that governments, corporations, whoever is a part of the powers that be, that they have continued to encroach upon our basic liberties. But I am saying that our enemy is not the dystopian forces of 1984's Big Brother and your favorite young adult novel. Our enemy is lack. It is our previous generation's lack of accepting responsibility after having defaced the social currency of our traditional community institutions, and therefore it has become our responsibility to revitalize the foundational institutions that once organized our civilizations. Many of us denying the hyperreal consensus reality while still affirming some kind of higher reality beyond pure materialism, which means that instead of claiming everything to be a part of the matrix, like a tatist, choosing to be another clown in clown world, laughing at the absurdity of life to prevent oneself from going mad, those that affirm tradition will become the rebels of new sincerity. Of course, I am cautiously optimistic about this potential future, and you should be too. But there is no other substantially sized cohort of society that has become so engaged with answering the big existential questions, which the crisis of meaning and disenchantment have been gradually prompting more of from us since the baby boomers began their reform of our mainstream culture. Outside of the merely theoretical, this group of Gen Zers are at least trying to radically change their ways of life to be better aligned with the values that often they just happen to stumble upon, then picked up, all while indulging in the same passive consumerist vices as every other Zoomer. So while a lot of us have a long way to go, with many of us lacking the basic self-discipline and any proper coaching required to execute our goals of radically reorientating our lifestyles completely by ourselves towards something more physically, mentally, and spiritually healthy, we are ahead of everyone else. In conclusion, the cause of the baby boomers' cultural elites have failed. Their cause has made our societies even more closed-minded than before, which has been detrimental to our ability to form bonds with people outside of our ever-closing little bubbles and bedrooms. So given this situation, the best solution seems to be a reset. Yes, just like Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum, which I completely support and which is what I have been supporting throughout this entire video. My ideas exactly align with them.
Just kidding, just kidding, just kidding. Ooh, I was joking. Ooh, funny guy.
Yeah, so a reset which could be ushered in by the cultural elites of Generation Z, or potentially a later generation. Despite only a few of us having grown up with the values of our great-grandparents, even completely spiritually dead atheists lacking a single religious bone in their bodies have begun to lament about the demise of what they may just simply reduce as social technologies, which were once provided by organized institutions to our real-world communities. I do not know how pragmatic our new leaders will be, but either way, this movement will be conceived on the basis that tradition might have failed some people from earlier generations due to at least perceived deviations too far into absolutism. But outside of tradition, nothing provides any proven long-term solutions. And though our roots have been cut off, we will try our damnedest to reconnect them, because we sure as hell cannot plant any new ones. That is, unless we start receiving divine revelation like Joseph Smith. In this video, we were concerned with understanding how irony became so anomalously prevalent in our culture. In the next video, we will go into more detail about the subjects of irony and sincerity by exploring why ironic detachment is so damaging to our ways of life, while also learning how irony could be harnessed to resolve our current psycho-spiritual problems. This has been Jimbo Rosenstein from Operation Mad Dog, Brunchco.com. Thank you for watching. If you stay till the end of this video, please subscribe, share, like, and comment. Thank you so much for watching this video. You have done me a great favor. Thank you so much. Keep spreading this video around. Thank you so much. Gooch. Gooch, gooch, gooch. Give me that gooch. Give me a little bit of that gooch, please. Thank you. No, more. Give me more. Oh, yeah. Keep spreading. Yes, please. And leave a comment.